Have you ever felt loved, but only when you're silent? Have you ever realized that your silence has become a prerequisite for the harmony of a relationship? That, to keep someone close, you've had to stop being who you are? If this sounds familiar, this video will be a game changer. Today, we're going to talk about the wound of those who learned that love demands sacrifice of voice, of space, of essence. But what if I told you that love that demands silence was never love? Stay with me until the end. What you're about to hear may not only heal an old part of you, it may also completely change the way you relate to others from now on. How many times have you stopped yourself from saying what you felt, just to avoid being rejected? How many times have you held back your tears, your anger, your truth, because you were afraid of seeming too much? How many times have you fallen apart, piece by piece, thinking you were loving, when, in fact, you were nullifying yourself? This story is more common than it seems, and it needs to be told. Learn silence. When silence becomes survival from an early age, we learn that love can come with conditions. Sometimes acceptance only comes when we behave right, when we don't bother others, when we don't overexpress. We grow up understanding that feeling is risky, and that speaking our minds is even worse. This learning becomes a silent survival mechanism. Silence is no longer a choice, it's a strategy. And the child who simply wanted to be heard grows up believing they need to hold back to be loved. Silence becomes protection. And later, imprisonment. In adult relationships, this pattern repeats itself. You even feel like saying something's bothering you, but you keep quiet. You fear being perceived as fragile, needy, or difficult. So you hold it in, you hoard it, you swallow it, and you hope the other person understands, even without words, what you need. But the other doesn't notice, because the other doesn't guess. And over time, the pain of not being understood mixes with the frustration of never feeling fully seen. You end up existing halfway, hoping that half will be enough, but it isn't. Because love that requires silence to exist is far from being love. True love allows voice, allows expression, allows complete presence. Any bond that requires you to disappear to be maintained is a bond with absence, not with connection. The worst part is that silence becomes a habit. You stay silent even when you could speak. You learn to anticipate the other person's reaction and edit your truth before even speaking it. This self-control, which appears to be maturity, is often just fear in disguise. Fear of loss, fear of rejection, fear of discovering that by showing who you are, the other person might leave. And this fear shapes relationships where your authenticity becomes a risk, not a right. This kind of relationship teaches you that feeling is dangerous, that being honest leaves you vulnerable, that your pain is more disturbing than it deserves to be welcomed. So instinctively, you suppress it, not because you want to, but because you've learned that showing it will punish you. But all silence exacts a price. The price comes in the form of anxiety, emotional distancing, resentment, and loneliness for both partners. The other person's presence is no longer enough because you're absent from yourself. And the question begins to scream inside. How much longer will I remain silent to be accepted? This is where many become emotionally ill, because no one can sustain the weight of a relationship for long, where they have to disappear to be loved. Childhood teaches us to swallow words. Many of our behaviors in adult relationships originate in childhood, and silence, as a way of trying to be accepted, is one of the main ones. You may not have heard directly that feeling is wrong, but you learned it through looks, silences, or a lack of listening. Children are highly sensitive to emotional rejection. When a strong emotion doesn't find a place to be welcomed, be it sadness, anger, or insecurity, it becomes a burden. And little by little, the child understands. If they express their feelings, They will be ignored, punished, or ridiculed. It is in this context that the fear of expressing oneself arises. When love is conditioned on obedience, passivity, or performance, the child learns not to be loved as they are, but as they are expected to be. And they mold themselves. They adapt. They become silent. This child becomes the adult who apologizes for feeling too much, who tries to not cause problems in the relationship, who thinks being at peace means not confronting, not criticizing, not saying when something hurts, and calls this maturity, when often it's just camouflaged fear. Worse, this adult believes that true love requires sacrifice, that if they have to suppress tears, tolerate discomfort, and accept indifference, it's because they're doing their part. They believe that loving means enduring, that expressing pain is weakness, but it isn't. True love requires courage to show yourself completely, to be honest about how you feel, to not pretend to be okay when you're not. And this is only possible when you begin to deconstruct what you learned as a child about emotional worthiness. The child you were deserves to be heard, rescued, validated. She no longer needs to hide. She can now count on you, on the adult you've become. And that starts when you tell yourself, feeling isn't wrong. By reconnecting with old pain, you begin to understand current patterns. You realize that it's not your current partner who's keeping you silent. It's your history that still dictates the rules of your expression. And this needs to be redefined. Giving voice to your emotions is, above all, an act of freedom. It's taking back authority over your internal experience. It's ceasing to outsource the power to silence or release your emotional truth. And this, reclaiming of your emotions, changes everything. Because when you understand that your pain has a root, you stop blaming yourself for feeling it. And you finally begin to embrace yourself without needing anyone's approval. The silence that makes you sick. How the unsaid becomes a symptom when you remain silent for too long. Something inside you begins to scream, but not with words. It's the body that speaks. It's the mind that becomes ill. It's the soul that withdraws. Silence, when imposed by fear rather than choice, becomes a slow-acting emotional poison. You feel that lump in your throat that won't go away. That constant anxiety, even in peaceful moments. The insomnia. The sadness that appears without warning. The irritation that flares up in small situations. These are all symptoms of a stifled truth. And the cruelest part is that you often don't even realize you're sick of silence. You think you're taking it well, controlling it, being mature. But deep down, your emotional system is begging for space, for listening, for expression. Relationships based on the unsaid are dangerous. They create a false peace, which feels more like an emotional Cold War. No one fights, but no one truly finds each other. Each person lives their own internal version of the story, lacking the courage to express their true needs. Over time, emotional distance sets in. You start to feel lonely even when you're with someone. And worst of all, you think this is normal, that all relationships fade, that all love turns to disinterest. But in reality, what's cooled is communication, the oxygen of bonding. When you don't talk about how you feel, the other person has no way of knowing. And even if they did, they wouldn't be able to guess the intensity. You start to create silent expectations, feel hurt in silence, and demand without words. And this undermines the connection. It's in this scenario that resentment is born. Because while you swallow everything to avoid conflict, you accumulate small frustrations that grow like stones in your chest. And there comes a time when you explode, not because of the last detail, but because of everything that wasn't said before. Healing begins with the courage to express yourself, not aggressively, but truthfully, saying what bothers you, what hurts, what needs to change. And most importantly, doing it for yourself, not to change someone else, but to honor your own experience. Expressing yourself is an act of self-care. It's declaring to yourself, my feelings matter. It's stopping negotiating your peace to maintain fragile relationships. It's understanding that the price of imposed silence is too high and that your emotional health can no longer be a bargaining chip, because loving in silence, suffering in silence, living in silence, that's not love, it's survival. And you deserve so much more than that. The distortion of deservingness. When you believe that love is enduring from a very young age, many of us learn that love is conditional on effort, that we will only be loved if we are kind, calm, helpful, and pleasant. And this seemingly harmless idea profoundly shapes the way we relate to one another in adulthood. You grow up believing you deserve love, that you have to work hard to earn it, that you can't bother, demand, or displease. And that's how the perverse logic takes hold. If I want to be loved, I have to endure it. Endure silence, absence, indifference. This distortion convinces you that enduring everything in the name of love is beautiful, that infinite patience is a virtue, that if you truly love, you will understand, tolerate, and persist. But what it doesn't tell you is that often this isn't love, it's fear. Fear of loss, fear of being left, fear of not being enough. You accept crumbs. You reinforce the idea that you don't deserve a feast. And little by little, you become complacent. You start to consider what hurts normal. You start to call love what, deep down, diminishes you. This is where self-esteem shatters, because you begin to measure your worth by your ability to endure pain, as if the more you endure, the more you prove you love. And this narrative is cruel, because the more you endure, the more you lose yourself. Pattern repeats itself in many relationships. You give yourself, you deny yourself, you adapt, and yet you still feel small, insecure, invisible, as if nothing were enough. Because deep down, it's not the other person who's setting conditions. It's you who never believed you deserved anything different. Deconstruction begins when you ask yourself, why do I think I need to endure to be loved? Who taught you this? At what point in your life did you begin to confuse love with extreme effort? True love doesn't ask you to sacrifice your dignity. It doesn't demand that you remain silent, hide, or disappear. True love sees you, listens to you, and embraces you, completely including your needs and limitations. Recognizing this distortion is a giant step toward emotional liberation. It's realizing that the love you seek from outside will only be possible when you stop violating yourself from within. When you understand that deserving love has nothing to do with enduring pain, because enduring is not proof of love. It's a sign of self-abandonment, and you've abandoned yourself for too long. Silence as a strategy. When you keep quiet to keep the other person. In many relationships, we learn to use silence as a survival tool. You swallow your words to avoid arguments. You stifle your emotions to avoid appearing too sensitive. You keep quiet, afraid of being too much or losing. This silence, which at first glance seems like wisdom, actually hides a deep wound, the fear of abandonment. It's not that you're naturally calm, it's that you've learned to associate emotional expression with rejection, and so you feel you need to be silent to be loved. Over time, this mechanism becomes automatic. You stop expressing your feelings, showing what's bothering you, saying what you want, and you begin to live in a kind of emotional self-effacement where your presence exists, but your voice doesn't. This pattern of emotional silence is dangerous. It not only disconnects you from others, it also disconnects you from yourself. You gradually lose intimacy with yourself because you no longer listen to yourself, validate yourself, or respect yourself. And the saddest thing is that often, The other person doesn't even demand this silence. But you've conditioned yourself so much to not be a problem that you automatically censor yourself. You act as if your discomfort isn't legitimate, as if your emotions are exaggerated. Deep down, this behavior stems from the belief that if you're light, easy, calm, the other person will stay. And this is a painful illusion. Because love, that depends on your silence, ... isn't love. It's fear disguised as connection. True love allows a voice. It allows expression. It allows vulnerability. It embraces, it doesn't silence. And it only fully exists when both feel safe to say, "This hurts me. This touches me. This matters to me." Breaking this pattern of silence is an act of courage. It's telling yourself, "My emotions are valid." It's starting to listen to yourself, respect yourself, and protect yourself. It's allowing the other person to truly know you with everything you feel. And, most importantly, it's about trusting that true love isn't afraid of your truth. Because those who truly love you want to hear you not silence you. The childhood, where it all began, the cradle of emotional silence. Silence we carry into adulthood wasn't born out of nowhere, it was learned. Often, even in childhood. In homes where crying was considered drama, questioning was considered disrespectful, and expressing feelings was synonymous with being inappropriate. Children learn that feeling is dangerous, and remaining silent is safer. The lack of emotional space in early relationships teaches us something profound, that love is conditional. That to be accepted, one must be pleasant, well-behaved, and restrained. And in this process, we learn to suppress our truest emotions, fearing they will reject. This learning becomes a pattern. As we grow up, we bring the same script into relationships. Don't bother. Don't get in the way. Don't weigh down. And we become experts at censoring our feelings, all in the name of acceptance. The problem is that this emotional silence doesn't protect us, it suffocates us. It creates fragile relationships where depth is traded for convenience, where we are accepted for an edited version of ourselves rather than for who we truly are. Many people spend their lives trying to deserve love as if they were always owed something. And without realizing it, they put their partner in the role of judge and themselves in the role of defendant, trying to prove they're good enough, light enough, unproblematic. But true love doesn't require proof, it requires presence. It's born of wholeness, not performance. It flourishes when there's room to feel, speak, and exist fully. The child you are may not have had this space, but the adult you are can decide to create it. You can decide that you will no longer swallow tears to keep company, that you will no longer smile on the outside while screaming on the inside. Breaking the silence imposed back then is a form of healing. It's telling yourself, "I allow myself to feel." And this is a radical step toward love of yourself and of others, because no one can truly love you if you don't even allow yourself to show the voice you silenced. How silence becomes self-betrayal fierce. A difference between giving in out of love, and remaining silent out of fear. When you constantly remain silent to maintain the peace, you're not being peaceful. You're being invisible. You're making deals with your pain to avoid losing the other person. And that price, sooner or later, becomes too high to bear. Silencing feelings, desires, annoyances, and desires is a subtle way of abandoning yourself. Each time you swallow a truth to avoid conflict, a part of you dissolves. And over time, what's left isn't love, it's weariness. The silent exhaustion of someone who betrays themselves every day in the name of a fragile affection. This kind of silence is dangerous because it masks pain. It gives the false impression of control, maturity, and stability. But inside, the body speaks with insomnia, anxiety, tachycardia, emotional crises that seem out of the blue, but are, in fact, accumulations of everything that has been swallowed. Self-betrayal is silent. It begins with phrases like, "I won't talk about it now. It's not that important. I'd better leave it alone." But gradually, you stop listening to yourself. And when your inner voice fades, the outside world becomes noisier. You begin to live for the approval of others, hoping for recognition that never comes. Because even you don't recognize your own truth. Many people call this emotional maturity. But maturity isn't about keeping everything quiet. It's about knowing how to express your feelings clearly and respectfully. It's about having the courage to speak out even when there's a risk of displeasing others. It's about maintaining your own presence, even if the other person doesn't fully understand. You weren't made to be molded to someone else's taste. A worthwhile love doesn't require you to nullify yourself to fit in. On the contrary, it invites you to take up space, to exist fully. True love begins when you hear your own voice again and decide it deserves to be spoken, even if it trembles. Reclaiming your voice is a revolutionary act. It's declaring, "My truth matters." And from that moment on, you no longer need to beg. For love, because you've already begun to truly love yourself, the root of silence. When childhood teaches that feeling is wrong, many people learn early on that feeling is dangerous. That crying is irritating. That complaining is annoying. That expressing anger is ugly. And so, even as children, they begin to do what seems safest. Keep quiet. Swallow what they feel. Adapt. Become easy to deal with. But this ease comes at a price. Self-abandonment. In childhood, the love we receive comes with many conditions. Be good. Don't cry. Don't make a fuss. Don't talk back. And children, to survive emotionally, learn that being loved requires self-censorship. They conform to adults' expectations so as not to lose the little affection they receive, because for them, abandonment is too dangerous. Over time, this pattern becomes internalized. The child grows up, becomes an adult, but continues to obey this ancient logic. If I show too much, they'll leave me. If I'm too intense, they'll reject me. If I bother them, they'll distance themselves. And so, this adult silences legitimate pain, hides deep emotions, and builds relationships where being loved requires disappearing. This childhood conditioning explains why you often fall silent without even realizing it. It's an automatic reflex, an emotional habit, something that repeats itself, not because it makes sense now, but because it was once necessary. The child you once were still lives within you, trying to protect you. Even if today, that protection suffocates you. Recognizing this is liberating, because by understanding that this silence isn't who you are, but rather something you've been taught, you can begin to unlearn. You can embrace this inner child, tell it that you're now safe, that you no longer need to be silent to be loved, that today you can exist with all your feelings and still be worthy of love. This is the beginning of reconstruction, because when you understand that remaining silent was a survival strategy, not a choice of love, you begin to regain the courage to feel, and to free yourself from the idea that being loved requires being invisible. The deserving distortion. When you believe love is a reward for good behavior, one of the most profound effects of emotional silence learned in childhood is the distortion of the idea of worthiness. You come to believe that you will only be loved if you are perfect. That love is earned through effort, sacrifice, and impeccable performance. And so begins a cycle where being yourself never seems enough, takes root in a subtle but powerful way. You blame yourself for every mistake, blame yourself for any discomfort you cause, constantly trying to guess what the other person expects. You smile when you want to cry, accept when you want to say no, keep quiet when something hurts you. Also, you don't lose affection because deep down, you believe it's conditional. This mindset turns love into a bargaining chip. Instead of something that flows naturally, it becomes something that must be bought with obedience, silence, and compromise. And so, you lose yourself in roles: the perfect partner, the exemplary son, the ever-available friend. But they all have one thing in common: they drain you. The cruelest thing is that, even after so much effort, the love you receive still seems fragile, unstable, and insufficient. Because it doesn't fulfill you. It doesn't validate who you are, only the persona you've created to be accepted. And no matter how much the mask smiles, inside, the emptiness grows. Breaking this logic requires a profound reconstruction. You need to look within and ask, when was I taught that I was only valuable when I pleased others? And from that answer, reclaim the truth. True love is not a prize. True love begins when you understand that you don't have to erase yourself to deserve it. And this understanding changes everything. It gives you back your autonomy. It gives you permission to exist with flaws, with emotions, with imperfections, and still be worthy of love. Because worthiness isn't how much you keep quiet, but how much you have the courage to be whole. When silence becomes a symptom, the physical and emotional consequences of being too quiet, constant silence isn't just an emotional gesture. It's also a bodily act. When you suppress your emotions, your body feels it. The accumulated tension transforms into symptoms many ignore: persistent fatigue, back pain, migraines, gastrointestinal problems. The body begins to speak everything the mouth can't express out. This disconnect between what you feel and what you say creates an internal war. On the outside, you appear fine, but inside, there's a stifled scream. And the more you try to maintain a facade of balance, the more your emotional health deteriorates. Anxiety, insomnia, tachycardia. The silence begins to eat away at you from within. The nervous system is highly sensitive to unresolved emotional stress. When you live in a constant state of alert, trying not to disturb, not to make mistakes, not to overreact, your body goes into survival mode. And living like this every day is exhausting. It's like being in an emotional minefield where any misstep can destroy the little piece you've built out. Furthermore, chronic silence affects your self-esteem. You begin to doubt the validity of your emotions, wondering if you're overreacting, if you have a right to feel this way. And each time you remain silent, you send your subconscious the message that your needs don't matter. This, over time, erodes your self-confidence. Healing necessarily involves regaining your voice through the exercise, however uncomfortable, of expressing yourself. It's not about yelling or fighting, but about affirming firmly and respectfully. This bothers me. I don't accept this. I deserve to be heard. Conscious speech is an act of self-love. It's the moment you begin to treat yourself as someone worthy of fully existing with voice, with emotion, with truth. The weight of trying to be perfect to deserve love from a very young age, we learn directly or indirectly that being loved comes with conditions. Don't cry, don't yell, don't bother. Little by little, we understand that expressing our feelings can push people away. And so we do what seems safest. We try to be perfect. We control everything. We hide our flaws. We silence our pain, all to be accepted. But this ideal of perfection is a prison, because no one can sustain an emotional persona for long. The more you try to live up to others' expectations, the further you distance yourself from your own essence. And this exacts a heavy price. You may even receive affection, but not for who you are, rather for who you pretend to be. Love that needs to be bought with constant effort isn't love, it's a bargain. You give up your spontaneity, your freest laugh, your most honest opinion, all in exchange for a place in someone's heart. But that kind of place is unstable. Any mistake, any flaw, any excess of emotion, and you feel like everything could fall apart. Trying to be perfect also prevents you from creating deep bonds, because those who constantly try to please are never truly known. You can be loved by many, but understood by almost no one. And this emptiness, this emotional isolation, can be even more painful than outright rejection. True liberation comes when you understand that real love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It requires the courage to be seen as you are, with all the shadows and lights. It's when you allow yourself to be imperfect, human, vulnerable, that you open up space to be genuinely loved. And that, yes, transforms your life from the inside out. When silence becomes an emotional addiction over time, remaining silent ceases to be a conscious choice and becomes an automatic reflex. You no longer think about whether or not to speak, you simply swallow. You become so accustomed to not being heard that you don't even try anymore. And this silent inhibition becomes an emotional addiction. You remain silent to avoid conflict, to maintain the peace, to avoid appearing fragile. But inside, your soul screams. This habit creates a dangerous illusion that everything is fine. People around you believe you are strong, balanced, and easygoing. But this outward tranquility is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lies a turbulent sea of bottled up feelings, unspoken hurts, ignored pain, crossed boundaries. And the more you remain silent, the more your body speaks in the form of anxiety, insomnia, tension, and psychosomatic illnesses. Being too silent makes you a stranger in your own life. You start to wonder who you are, what you like, what you want. And these questions scare you because you've spent so much time adapting to your surroundings that you no longer know what's your desire and what's other people's expectations. The problem isn't just staying silent, but the reason behind it. Silence by choice is maturity. Silence out of fear is trauma. And when fear dictates the pace of your expression, you stop living fully. Your relationships become shallow. Your bonds become negotiations. Your emotional life is reduced to survival, not flourishing. Healing begins when you realize you have a voice, and that this voice, even if it's shaky, deserves space. Speaking isn't about convincing others, it's about freeing yourself. And when you start to truly listen to yourself, you realize that the silence that hurt the most was the one inside. Reconstructing identity, remembering who you were before the silence. When you spend too much time keeping quiet to be accepted, you begin to forget yourself. Little by little, your tastes, your opinions, your dreams take a back seat. You adapt so much that you become a reflection of what's expected, no longer who you are. And the most painful thing is that, over time, this forgetfulness becomes a habit, a way of existing without presence. But identity doesn't disappear. It slumbers. It's there, quiet, waiting for its moment to resurface. And that moment begins when you ask a simple yet powerful question. Who was I before I had to be silent to be loved? This question has the power to redeem. It brings to the surface memories, desires, and values that were buried under the fear of rejection. Rebuilding. Your identity is like renovating an old house. It takes patience, care, and a lot of courage. You'll rediscover parts of yourself that were broken, forgotten, or neglected. But you'll also rediscover the beauty that never disappeared. It was just stifled by constant compromise. This process is profound. It requires reevaluating what you call love, reviewing the roles you've accepted, and often distancing yourself from those who benefited from your silence. Yes, it can be lonely at first, but the solitude of finding yourself again is richer than the company of those who only accepted you in silence. You don't have to go back to who you were. You need to remember who you are now with all you've learned. Your identity isn't the absence of pain. It's the sum total of everything you've survived and yet remained capable of feeling. Rediscovering your own voice, expressing yourself without guilt. For a long time, you believed that speaking your mind was synonymous with conflict, that saying what you felt would ruin everything. That's how you learned to keep quiet, to smile with your lips and scream inside. But there comes a time when your body can no longer swallow truths, and your soul begins to sicken from all that couldn't be said. Rediscovering your own voice doesn't happen suddenly. It's born from a small gesture, a timid outburst, a whispered no, a will that asserts itself. Each time you express yourself honestly, no matter how small, you rebuild yourself. You plant roots within yourself, and that is freedom. God, saying what you feel, what bothers you, what you dream about, isn't selfish. It's presence. It's emotional maturity. It's remembering that your truth has a place in the world, and that being loved shouldn't depend on your ability to deny yourself. The guilt that often arises when you begin to speak out is just the echo of an old emotional system that taught you that love and silence go hand in hand. But they don't. Love and truth go hand in hand. Affection and listening go hand in hand. Over time, you realize that people who truly love you don't silence you. They listen to you. They aren't bothered by your voice. They connect with it. And relationships that don't survive your authenticity were never true. They were just fragile constructions, sustained by compromises that no longer exist. Rediscovering your voice is Wazu, an act of return back to the center of your being, where you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to exist fully. And when you reach this place, you'll never again accept relationships where you have to be silent to fit in. The love that begins when you no longer abandon yourself. After so many imposed silences, so many swallowed feelings, and so many versions of yourself mutilated to fit into the other's love, the moment arrives to turn the key. A moment sometimes silent, where you understand that continuing to erase yourself for fear of rejection is rejecting yourself before the other person does. And that true love only begins to exist when you decide to never abandon yourself. Again, not abandoning yourself is more than resisting toxic relationships. It's protecting yourself from the subtleties that hurt, the jokes that diminish, the gestures that ignore, the words that erase. It's understanding that your emotional integrity is more valuable than any romance that depends on your emotional submission to survive. When you choose yourself truly, something profound changes. Your presence begins to carry weight, not the weight of fear, but the weight of dignity. Relationships begin to be built on respect, not emotional bargaining. You no longer need to prove your worth, you inhabit it. And it is in this inner place of serene strength that love can truly flourish. Not the idealized kind, where everything is perfect, but a real love, where there's room for your voice, your limits, your wholeness. A love where there's no fear of loss, because no one is trying to save themselves through the other. This is the love that liberates, that sustains, that embraces. But above all, this is the love that begins within you. And once it takes hold, you never again negotiate what you once called love, but was merely an absence of self. If this video touched deep wounds, it's because it might be time to heal them. Today you took a courageous step toward your emotional truth. We talked about the pain of silence, the price of abandoning yourself, and the power of finding your voice again. If this resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That way, you'll help me bring this content to those who also need to hear these words. And remember, you no longer need to be silent to be loved. Your voice is sacred. Take care of it